Oliver Sacks, The Mind's Eye. Face blind. It is with our faces that we face the world, from the moment of birth to the moment of death. Our age and our sex are printed on our faces. Our emotions, the open and instinctive emotions which Darwin wrote about, as well as the hidden or repressed ones which Freud wrote about, are displayed on our faces along with our thoughts and intentions. Though we may admire arms and legs, breasts and buttocks, it is the face, first and last, which is judged beautiful in an aesthetic sense, fine or distinguished in a moral or intellectual sense. And crucially, it is by our faces that we can be recognized as individuals. Our faces bear the stamp of our experiences and character. At 40, it is said, a man has the face he deserves. At 2.5 months, babies respond to smiling faces by smiling back. As the child smiles, Everett Ellenwood writes, it usually engages the adult human to interact with him, to smile, to talk, to hold. In other words, to initiate the processes of socialization. The reciprocal understanding mother-child relationship is possible only because of the continuing dialogue between faces. The face, psychoanalysts consider, is the first object to acquire visual meaning and significance. But are faces in a special category as far as the nervous system is concerned? I have had difficulty recognizing faces for as long as I can remember. I did not think too much about this as a child, but by the time I was a teenager in a new school, it was often a cause of embarrassment. My frequent inability to recognize schoolmates would cause them bewilderment and sometimes offense. It did not occur to them, why should it, that I had a perceptual problem. I usually recognize close friends without much problem, especially my two best friends, Eric Korn and Jonathan Miller, but this was partly because I identified particular features. Eric had heavy eyebrows and thick spectacles, and Jonathan was tall and gangly, with a mop of red hair. Jonathan was a keen observer of postures, gestures, and facial expressions, and he seemingly never forgot a face. A decade later, when we were looking at old school photos, he could still recognize literally hundreds of our schoolmates, while I could not recognize a single one. It was not just faces. When I went for a walk or a bicycle ride, I would have to follow exactly the same route, knowing that if I deviated from it even slightly, I would be instantly and hopelessly lost. I wanted to be adventurous, to go to exotic places, but I could do this only if I bicycled with a friend. At the age of 76, despite a lifetime of trying to compensate, I have no less trouble with faces and places. I am thrown particularly when I see people out of context, even if I have been with them 5 minutes before. This happened one morning just after my appointment with my psychiatrist. I had been seeing him twice weekly for several years at this point. A few minutes after I left his office, a soberly dressed man greeted me in the lobby of the building. I was puzzled as to why this stranger seemed to know me, until the doorman addressed him by my name. I'm going to read that again. I was puzzled as to why the stranger seemed to know me until the doorman addressed him by my name. It was, of course, my own analyst. This failure to recognize him came up as a topic in our next session. I think he did not entirely believe me when I maintained that it had a neurological basis rather than a psychiatric one. A few months later, my nephew Jonathan Sacks came for a visit. We went out for a walk. I lived in Mount Vernon, New York at the time, and it started raining. We had better get back, Jonathan said, but I couldn't find my house or my street. After 2 hours of walking around, in which we both got thoroughly soaked, I heard a shout. It was my landlord. He said he had seen me pass the house 3 or 4 times, apparently failing to recognize it. In those years, I had to take the Boston Post Road to get from Mount Vernon to my hospital on Allerton Avenue in the Bronx. Though I took the same route twice a day for 8 years, the road never became familiar to me. I never recognized the buildings on either side, and I would often turn the wrong way up the road, realizing it only when I came to one of two landmarks that were unmistakable, even for me, at one end, Allerton Avenue, which had a large sign, or at the other, the Bronx River Parkway, which loomed over the Boston Post Road. I had been working with my assistant, Kate, for about 6 years when we arranged to rendezvous in a midtown office for a meeting with my publisher. I arrived and announced myself to the receptionist, but failed to note that Kate had already arrived and was sitting in the waiting area. That is, I saw a young woman there, but did not realize it was her. After about 5 minutes, smiling, she said, "Hello, Oliver. I was wondering how long it would take you to recognize me." Parties, even my own birthday parties, are a challenge. More than once, Kate has asked my guests to wear name tags. I have been accused of absent-mindedness, and no doubt this is true, but I think that a significant part of what is variously called my shyness, my reclusiveness, my social ineptitude, my eccentricity, even my Asperger's syndrome, is a consequence and a misinterpretation of my difficulty recognizing faces. My problem with recognizing faces extends not only to my nearest and dearest, but also to myself. Thus, on several occasions, I have apologized for almost bumping into a large bearded man, only to realize that the large bearded man was myself in a mirror. The opposite situation once occurred at a restaurant with tables outside. Sitting at one of these sidewalk tables, I turned to the restaurant window and began grooming my beard, as I often do. I then realized that what I had taken to be my reflection was not grooming himself, but looking at me oddly. There was in fact a gray-bearded man on the other side of the window, who must have been wondering why I was preening myself in front of him. Kate often cautions people in advance about my little problem. She tells visitors, "Don't ask if he remembers you, because he will say no. Introduce yourself by name and tell him who you are." And to me, she says, "Don't just say no. That's rude and will upset people. Say I'm sorry. I'm awful about recognizing people. I wouldn't recognize my own mother." In 1988, I met Franco Magnani, the memory artist, and over the next couple of years, I spent weeks with him, talking about his paintings, his life, and even traveling to Italy with him to revisit the village where he grew up. When I finally submitted an article about him to The New Yorker, Robert Gottlieb, who was then the magazine's editor-in-chief, read the piece and said, "Very nice, fascinating, but what does he look like? Can you add some description?" I parried this awkward and to me unanswerable question by saying, "Who cares what he looks like? The piece is about his work." "Our readers will want to know," Bob said. "They need to picture him." "I will have to ask Kate," I said. Bob gave me a peculiar look. I assumed that I was just very bad at recognizing faces, as my friend Jonathan was very good. That this was within the limits of normal variation, and that he and I just stood at opposite ends of a spectrum. It was only when I went to Australia to visit my older brother, Marcus, whom I had scarcely seen in 35 years, and discovered that he too had exactly the same difficulties recognizing faces and places, that it dawned on me that this was something beyond normal variation, that we both had a specific trait, a so-called prosopagnosia, probably with a distinctive genetic basis. That there were others like me was brought home in various ways. The meeting of two people with prosopagnosia, in particular, can be very challenging. A few years ago, I wrote to one of my colleagues to tell him that I admired his new book. His assistant then phoned Kate to arrange a meeting, and they settled on a weekend dinner at a restaurant in my neighborhood. "There may be a problem," Kate said. "Dr. Sachs cannot recognize anyone." "It's the same with Dr. W," his assistant replied. "And another thing," Kate added, "Dr. Sachs cannot find restaurants or other places. He gets lost very easily. He can't even recognize his own building sometimes." "Yes, it's the same with Dr. W," his assistant said. Somehow, we did manage to meet and enjoy dinner together, but I still have no idea what Dr. W looks like, and he probably would not recognize me either. Although such examples may seem comical, they are sometimes quite devastating. People with very severe prosopagnosia may be unable to recognize their spouse or to pick out their own child in a group of others. Jane Goodall also has a certain degree of prosopagnosia. Her problems extend to recognizing chimpanzees as well as people. Thus, she says she is often unable to distinguish individual chimps by their faces. Once she knows a particular chimp well, she ceases to have difficulties. Similarly, she has no problem with family and friends, but she says, "I have huge problems with people with average faces. I have to search for a mole or something. I find it very embarrassing. I can be all day with someone and not know them the next day." She adds that she, too, has difficulties in recognizing places. "I just don't know where I am until I am very familiar with the route. I have to turn and look at landmarks so I can find my way back. This was a problem in the forest, and I often got lost." In 1985, I published a case history called "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat," about Dr. P, who had developed a very severe visual agnosia. He was not able to recognize faces or their expressions. Moreover, he could not identify or even categorize objects. Thus, he was unable to recognize a glove, to recognize that it was an article of clothing or that it resembled a hand. At one point, he mistook his wife's head for his hat. After Dr. P's story was published, I began to get letters from correspondents who would compare their difficulties in recognizing places and faces with his. In 1991, Anne F. wrote to me, describing her experience. "I believe that 3 people in my immediate family have visual agnosias: my father, a sister, and myself. We each have traits in common with you. We each have traits in common with your Dr. P, but hopefully not to the same degree. The most striking behavior we all share in common with Dr. P is a prosopagnosia. My father, a man who has had a successful radio career here in Canada, his particular gift is an ability to mimic voices, was unable to recognize his wife in a recent photograph. At a wedding reception, he asked a stranger to identify the man sitting next to his daughter, my husband of 5 years at the time. I've walked by my husband while staring directly at his face on several occasions without recognizing him. I have no difficulty recognizing him. However, in situations or places where I am expecting to see him, I am also able to recognize people immediately when they begin to speak, even if I've heard their voice only once in the past. Unlike Dr. P, I feel I can read people well on an emotional level. I don't have the degree of agnosia for common objects that Dr. P had. However, like Dr. P, I am totally incapable of establishing a topographical representation of space. I have no memory from where I put things unless I verbally encode the location. Once an object leaves my hands, it drops off the edge of the world into a void. While Anne F. seems to have prosopagnosia and topographical agnosia on a genetic or familial basis, others may develop this or any other form of agnosia in consequence of a stroke, a tumor, an infection, or an injury, or, like Dr. P, a degenerative disease such as Alzheimer's that has damaged a particular part of the brain. Joan C., another correspondent, had an unusual history in this regard. She had developed a brain tumor in the right occipital lobe as an infant, and this was removed when she was 2 years old. It seems likely, though it is difficult to be certain, that her prosopagnosia was the result of either the tumor or the surgery. Her inability to recognize faces has often been misinterpreted by others. She notes, "I've been told that I'm rude, or a space cadet, or, according to a psychiatrist, suffering from a psychiatric disorder." As I continued to receive more and more letters from people with prosopagnosia or topographical agnosia, it became clear to me that my visual problem was not uncommon and must affect many people around the world. Face recognition is crucially important for humans, and the vast majority of us are able to identify thousands of faces individually or to easily pick out familiar faces in a crowd. A special expertise is needed to make such distinctions, and this expertise is nearly universal not only in humans, but in other primates. How then do people with prosopagnosia manage? In the last few decades, we have become very conscious of the brain's plasticity, how one part or system of the brain may take over the functions of a defective or damaged one, but this does not seem to occur with prosopagnosia or topographical agnosia. They are usually lifelong conditions that do not lessen as one grows older. People with prosopagnosia, therefore, need to be resourceful and inventive, need to find strategies, ways of circumventing their deficits, recognizing people by an unusual nose or beard, spectacles, or a certain sort of clothing. Many prosopagnosics recognize people by voice, posture, or gait, and of course, context and expectation are paramount. One expects to see one's students at school, one's colleagues at the office, and so on. Such strategies, both conscious and unconscious, become so automatic that people with moderate prosopagnosia can remain unaware of how poor their facial recognition actually is, and are startled if it is revealed to them by testing, for example, with photographs that omit ancillary clues such as hair or eyeglasses. Thus, though I may be unable to recognize a particular face at a glance, I can recognize various things about a face, that there's a large nose, a pointed chin, tufted eyebrows, or protruding ears. Such features become identifying markers by which I recognize people. I think, for similar reasons, I find it easier to recognize a caricature than a straightforward portrait or photograph. I am reasonably good at judging age and gender, though I've made a few embarrassing blunders here. I am far better at recognizing people by the way they move, their motor style. And even if I cannot recognize particular faces, I am sensitive to the beauty of faces and to their expressions. I avoid conferences, parties, and large gatherings as much as I can, knowing that they will lead to anxiety and embarrassing situations, not only failing to recognize people I know well, but greeting strangers as old friends. Like many prosopagnosics, I avoid greeting people by name, lest I use the wrong one, and I depend on others to save me from egregious social blunders. I am much better at recognizing my neighbors' dogs. They have characteristic shapes and colors than my neighbors themselves. Thus, when I see a youngish woman with a Rhodesian Ridgeback hound, I realize that she lives in the apartment next to mine. If I see an older lady with a friendly golden retriever, I know this is someone from down the block. But if I should pass either woman on the street without her dog, she might as well be a complete stranger. The idea that the mind, an immaterial, airy thing, could be embodied in a lump of flesh, the brain, was intolerable to 17th century religious thinking, hence the dualism of Descartes and others. But physicians, observing the effects of strokes and other brain injuries, had long had reason to suspect that the functions of the mind and brain were linked. Towards the end of the 18th century, the anatomist Franz Joseph Gall proposed that all mental functions must arise from the brain, not from the soul, as many people imagined, or from the heart or the liver. Instead, he envisioned within the brain a collection of 27 organs, each responsible for a different moral or mental faculty. Such faculties for Gall included that we would now call perceptual functions, such as the sensation of color or sound, cognitive faculties, like memory, mechanical aptitude, or speech and language, and even moral traits such as friendship, benevolence, or pride. For these heretical ideas, he was exiled from Vienna and wound up eventually in revolutionary France, where he hoped a more scientific approach might be embraced. The physiologist Jean-Pierre Florenz decided to investigate Gall's theory by removing slices of the brain in living animals, chiefly pigeons. But he could not find any evidence to correlate specific ideas of the cortex with specific faculties, perhaps because one needs very delicate and discrete ablations to do so, especially in the tiny pigeon cortex. So Florenz believed that the cognitive impairments his pigeons exhibited as he removed more pieces of cortex reflected only the amount of cortex removed, not its location and what applied to birds, he felt, probably also applied to human beings. The cortex, he concluded, was equipotential, as homogeneous and undifferentiated as the liver. The brain, Florence said, only half jesting, secretes thought as the liver secretes bile. Florence's notion of an equipotential cortex dominated thought until the studies of Paul Broca in the 1860s. Broca performed autopsies on many patients with expressive aphasia, all of whom, he showed, had damage limited to the frontal lobes on the left side. In 1865, he was able to say famously, "We speak with our left hemisphere," and the notion of a homogeneous and undifferentiated brain, it seemed, was laid to rest. Broca felt that he had located a motor center for words in a particular part of the left frontal lobe, an area we now call Broca's area. This seemed to promise a new sort of localization, a genuine correlation of neurological and cognitive functions with specific centers in the brain. Neurology moved confidently ahead, identifying centers of every sort. Broca's motor center for words was followed by Wernicke's auditory center for words, and Desjardins' visual center for words, all in the left hemisphere, the language hemisphere, and a center for visual recognition in the right hemisphere. But while visual agnosia of a general sort was recognized in the 1890s, there was little idea that there could be agnosia for particular visual categories, like faces or places, even though major figures like Hewlings, Jackson, and Charcot had already described specific agnosias for faces and places, following damage to the posterior areas of the right hemisphere. In 1872, Jackson described a man who, following a stroke in this area, lost his ability to recognize places and persons. At one time, he did not know his wife, and having wandered from home, was unable to find his way back. Charcot, in 1883, provided an account of a patient who had enjoyed exceptional powers of visual imagery and memory, but lost these suddenly. Charcot describes how this man cannot even recall his own face. Recently, in a public gallery, his path seemed to be stopped by a person to whom he was about to offer his excuses, but it was merely his own image reflected in a glass. Still, even by the middle of the 20th century, many neurologists doubted whether the brain had category-specific recognition areas. This may have played a part in delaying the recognition of face blindness, despite the evidence from clinical cases. In 1947, Joachim Bodemer, a German neurologist, described 3 patients who were unable to recognize faces but had no other difficulties with recognition. It seemed to Bodemer that this highly selective form of agnosia needed a special name. It was he who coined the term prosopagnosia, and that such a specific loss must imply that there was a discrete area in the brain specialized for face recognition. This has been a matter of dispute ever since. Is there a special system dedicated only to face recognition, or is face recognition simply one function of a more general visual recognition system? MacDonald Critchley, writing in 1953, was highly critical of Bodemer's article and of the very idea of face blindedness. It seems scarcely credible, he wrote, that human faces should occupy a perceptual category which is different from all other objects in space, animate and inanimate. Can there be any attribute of size, shape, coloring, or motility which distinguishes a human face from other objects in such a way as to preclude identification? But in 1955, the English neurologist Christopher Pallas published a beautifully detailed and documented study of his patient, A.H., a mining engineer at a Welsh colliery who kept a journal and was able to give Pallas an articulate and insightful description of his experiences. One night in June of 1953, A.H. apparently suffered a stroke. He suddenly felt unwell after a couple of drinks at his club. He appeared to be confused and was taken home to bed. He had slept poorly. Getting up the following morning, he found his visual world completely transformed, as he reported to Palace. I got out of my bed. My mind was clear, but I could not recognize the bedroom. I went to the toilet. I had difficulty finding my way and recognizing the place. Turning round to go back to bed, I found I couldn't recognize the room, which was a strange place to me. I could not see color, only being able to distinguish light objects from dark ones. Then I found out all faces were alike. I couldn't tell the difference between my wife and my daughters. Later, I had to wait for my wife or mother to speak before recognizing them. My mother is 80 years old. I can see the eyes, nose, and mouth quite clearly, but they just don't add up. They all seem chalked in like on a blackboard. His difficulty was not limited to recognizing people in real life. I cannot recognize people in photographs, not even myself. At the club, I saw someone strange staring at me and asked the steward who it was. You'll laugh at me. I'd been looking at myself in a mirror. I later went to London and visited several cinemas and theaters. I couldn't make head or tail of the plots. I never knew who was who. I bought some copies of Men and Only. Oh my goodness. I bought some copies of Men Only and London Opinion. I couldn't enjoy the usual pictures. I could work out what was what by accessory details, but it's no fun that way. You've got to take it in at a glance. A.H. had other visual problems. A small defect in one corner of his visual fields, transient difficulty with reading, a total inability to perceive color, and difficulty identifying places. He had initially had some odd sensations on the left too, a heaviness of the left hand, and a stinging feeling in his left index finger and the left corner of his mouth. But he had no object agnosia. He was able to sort out geometrical figures, to draw complex objects, to assemble jigsaw puzzles, and play chess. Since Palace's time, a number of patients with prosopagnosia have come to autopsy. Here the data are clear. Virtually all patients who acquire prosopagnosia, irrespective of the cause, have lesions in the right visual association cortex, in particular on the underside of the occipitotemporal cortex. There is nearly always damage in a structure called the fusiform gyrus. These autopsy results gained additional support in the 1980s, when it became possible to visualize the brains of living patients by using CT scans and MRIs. Here, too, prosopagnosic patients showed lesions in what came to be called the fusiform face area. Abnormal activity in the fusiform face area has also been correlated with hallucinations of faces, as Dominic Fitch and his colleagues have shown. In the 1990s, such lesion studies were complemented by functional imaging. In the 1990s, such lesion studies were complemented by functional imaging, visualizing the brains of people with fMRIs as they looked at pictures of faces, places, and objects. These functional studies demonstrated that looking at faces activated the fusiform face area much more strongly than looking at other test images. That individual neurons in this area could show preferences was first demonstrated in 1969 by Charles Gross and his colleagues using electrodes in the inferotemporal cortex of macaque. Gross found cells that responded dramatically to the sight of a monkey's paw, but also less strongly to a variety of other stimuli, including a human hand. Subsequently, he found cells with a relative preference for faces. At this purely visual level, faces are distinguished as configurations, in part by detecting the geometrical relationships between eyes, nose, mouth, and other features, as Freewald, Tsao, and Livingston have established. But there is no preference at this level for individual faces. Indeed, generic or cartoon faces can elicit the same responses as real ones. Recognition of particular faces or objects is only achieved at a higher cortical level, in the multimodal area of the medial temporal lobe, which has rich reciprocal connections, not only to the fusiform face area, but to other areas subserving sensory association, emotion, and memory. Christoph Koch Itzhak Fried and their colleagues have shown that cells in the multimodal medial temporal lobe area show remarkable specificity, responding only, for example, to images of Bill Clinton or spiders or the Empire State Building or cartoons from The Simpsons. Specific neural units may also respond to hearing or reading the name of the person or object. Thus, in one patient, a set of neurons responded strongly to pictures of the Sydney Opera House and also to the letter string Sydney Opera, though not to the names of other landmarks, such as Eiffel Tower. Neurons in the medial temporal lobe are capable of encoding representations of individual faces, landmarks, or objects so that they can be easily recognized in a changing environment. Such representations can be constructed rapidly, within less than a day or two after exposure to an unfamiliar individual. Although such studies involve electrode recordings from single neurons, each of these cells is connected to thousands of other neurons, each of which is in turn connected to thousands more. Some single cells, moreover, may respond to more than one individual or object. So a single cell's response really represents the apex of an immense computational pyramid, perhaps drawing on direct or indirect inputs from the visual, auditory, or tactile cortex, text recognition areas, memory and emotional areas, and so on. In humans, some ability to recognize faces is present at birth or soon after. By 6 months, as Oliver Pascalis and his colleagues have shown in one study, babies are able to recognize a broad variety of individual faces, including those of another species. In this study, pictures of monkeys were used. By 9 months, though, the babies became less adept at recognizing monkeys' faces unless they had received continuing exposure to them. As early as 3 months, infants are learning to narrow their model of faces to those they are frequently exposed to. The implications of this work for humans are profound. To a Chinese baby brought up in his own ethnic environment, Caucasian faces may all, relatively, look the same and vice versa. One prosopagnosia acquaintance, born and raised in China, went to Oxford as a student and has lived there for decades in the United States. Nonetheless, he tells me, European faces are the most difficult. They all look the same to me. It seems that there is an innate and presumably genetically determined ability to recognize faces, and this capacity gets focused in the first year or two so that we become especially good at recognizing the sorts of faces we are likely to encounter. Our face cells, already present at birth, need experience to develop fully. It is similar with many other capacities, from stereo vision to linguistic power. Some predisposition or potential is built in genetically but requires stimulation, practice, environmental richness, and nourishment if it is to develop fully. Natural selection may bring about the initial predisposition, but experience and experiential selection are needed to bring our cognitive and perceptual capacities to their full realization. The fact that many, though not all, people with prosopagnosia also have difficulty with recognizing places has suggested to some researchers that face and place recognition are mediated by distinct yet adjacent areas. Others believe that both are mediated by a single zone, which is perhaps more oriented to faces at one end and to places at the other. The neuropsychologist Elkanon Goldberg, however, questions the whole notion of discrete, hardwired centers or modules with fixed functions in the cerebral cortex. He feels that at higher cortical levels, there may be much more in the way of gradients, where areas whose function is developed by experience and training overlapped or grade into one another. In his book, The New Executive Brain, he speculates that a gradiential principle constitutes an evolutionary alternative to a modular one, permitting a degree of flexibility and plasticity impossible for a brain organized in a purely modular fashion. While modularity, he argues, may be characteristic of the thalamus, an assemblage of nuclei with fixed functions, fixed inputs, and outputs, the gradiential organization is more characteristic of the cerebral cortex and becomes more and more prominent as one ascends from primary sensory cortex to association cortex to the highest level of all, the frontal cortex. Modularity and gradients may thus coexist and complement one another. People with prosopagnosia, even if their chief complaint is of face blindness, often have difficulty recognizing other specific things. Orrin Davinsky and Martha Farah have remarked that some prosopagnosics are unable to distinguish an apple from a pear, say, or a pigeon from a raven, although they can correctly recognize the general category of fruit or bird. Jonesy described a similar problem. I don't recognize handwriting in the same way that I don't recognize faces. That is, I might be able to identify a sample of handwriting by recognizing some salient feature or by seeing it in context, but otherwise, forget it. I've even failed to recognize my own handwriting. Some researchers have proposed that prosopagnosia is not purely a problem with face blindness, but one aspect of a more general difficulty in distinguishing the individuals in any class, whether the class is of faces, cars, birds, or anything else. Isabelle Gauthier and her colleagues at Vanderbilt tested a group of car experts and a group of expert birders, comparing them to a group of normal subjects. The fusiform face area, they found, was activated when all of the groups looked at pictures of faces, but it was also activated in the car experts when they were asked to identify particular cars, and in the birders when they were asked to identify particular birds. The fusiform face area is primarily tuned for facial recognition, but some of it seems can be trained to distinguish individual items of other sorts. If then an expert bird spotter or car buff is unlucky enough to acquire prosopagnosia, he will also, we might suspect, lose his facility for identifying birds or cars. The brain is more than an assemblage of autonomous modules, each critical for a specific mental function. Every one of these functionally specialized areas must interact with dozens or hundreds of others, their total integration creating something like a vastly complicated orchestra with thousands of instruments, an orchestra that conducts itself with an ever-changing score and repertoire. The fusiform face area does not work in isolation. It is a vital node in a cognitive network that stretches from the occipital cortex to the prefrontal area. Face blindness may occur even with an intact fusiform face area if the lower occipital face areas are damaged. And people with moderate prosopagnosia, like Jane Goodall or myself, can, after repeated exposure, learn to identify those we know best. Perhaps this is because we are using slightly different pathways to do so, or perhaps with training we can make better use of our relatively weak fusiform face areas. Above all, the recognition of faces depends not only on the ability to parse the visual aspects of a face, its particular features and their overall configuration, and compared to others, but the ability to summon the memories, experiences, and feelings associated with that face. The recognition of specific places or faces, as Pallas emphasized, goes with a particular feeling, a sense of association and meaning. While purely visual recognition of faces is mediated by the fusiform face area and its connections, emotional familiarity is mediated at a higher multimodal level, where there are intimate connections with the hippocampi and amygdala, areas dedicated to memory and emotion. Thus, A.H., after his stroke, lost not only his ability to identify faces, but the sense of familiarity. Every face and place appeared new to him and continued to do so, even if seen again and again. Recognition is based on knowledge. Familiarity is based on feeling. But neither entails the other. The two have different neural bases and can be disassociated. Thus, although both are lost in tandem with prosopagnosia, one can have familiarity without recognition, or recognition without familiarity in other conditions. The former occurs in déjà vu and also in the hyperfamiliarity for faces described by Davinsky. Here, a patient may find that everyone on the bus or on the street looks familiar. He may go up to them and address them as old friends, even while realizing that he cannot possibly know them at all. My father was very sociable and could recognize hundreds or even thousands of people, but his feeling of knowing people became exaggerated, perhaps pathological, as he moved into his 90s. He often attended concerts at the Wigmore Hall in London, and there, during the intermissions, he would accost everyone in sight, saying, "Do I know you?" The opposite occurs in patients with Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome, for whom people's faces, though recognized, no longer generate a sense of emotional familiarity. Since a husband or wife or child does not convey that special warm feeling of familiarity, the Capgras patient will argue they cannot be the real thing. They must be clever imposters, counterfeits. People with prosopagnosia have insight. They realize that their problems with recognition come from their own brains. People with Capgras syndrome, in contrast, remain immovable in their conviction that they are perfectly normal and it is the other person who is profoundly, even uncannily wrong. People with acquired prosopagnosia, like AH or Dr. P, are relatively rare. Most neurologists are likely to encounter such a patient once or twice in their career, if at all. Congenital prosopagnosia, or as it is sometimes called, developmental prosopagnosia, such as I have, is much commoner, yet remains completely unrecognized by most neurologists. Heather Sellers, a lifelong prosopagnosic, wrote about this in a 2007 autobiographical essay. "I couldn't recognize my husband's children. I hugged the wrong man in the grocery, thinking it was my husband. My colleagues remained unidentifiable after a decade. I kept introducing myself to neighbors." When she consulted two separate neurologists for her problem, they both said that they had never seen it before, and it was very rare. One eminent neurologist who has written about visual agnosia confessed to me that he had not even heard of congenital prosopagnosia until very recently. This, however, is not entirely surprising, for people with congenital prosopagnosia do not generally consult neurologists about their problem, any more than someone with lifelong colorblindness would complain about it to an eye doctor. It's just the way they are. But Ken Nakayama at Harvard, who investigates visual perception, has long suspected that prosopagnosia is relatively common but underreported. In 1999, he and his colleague Brad Duchesne at University College London began using the internet to seek subjects with face blindness, and they received a startling response. They are now investigating several thousand people with lifelong prosopagnosia, ranging from mild to cripplingly severe. While people with lifelong prosopagnosia do not have gross lesions in the brain, a recent study by Lucia Garrido and her colleagues showed that they do have subtle but distinct changes in the brain's face recognition areas. The condition also tends to be familial. Duchesne, Nakayama, and their colleagues have described one family in which 10 members, both parents and 7 of their 8 children, the 8th could not be tested, as well as a maternal uncle, have it. Clearly, there are strong genetic determinants at work here. Nakayama and Duchesne have explored the neural basis of face and place recognition, generating new knowledge and insights at every level from the genetic to the cortical. They have also studied the psychological effects and social consequences of developmental prosopagnosia and topographical agnosia, the special problems these conditions can create for an individual in a complex social and urban culture. The range seems to extend in a positive direction, too. Russell, Duchesne, and Nakayama have described super recognizers, people with extraordinarily good face recognition abilities, including some who seem to have indelible memories of virtually every face they have ever seen. Alexandra Lynch, one of my correspondents, described her own uncanny ability to recognize people. "It happened again yesterday. I was on my way down into the subway in Soho when I identified someone 15 feet ahead of me, back turned, talking intimately with his friend, as a man I knew or had seen before. In this case, it was Mac, who used to be a family friend's art dealer. I had last seen him briefly 2 years earlier at an opening in Midtown. I'm not sure I've ever spoken with him beyond an introduction a good 10 years ago. This is an integral part of my life. I catch a passing glimpse of someone and with no real effort, flash, place the face. Yes, that's the girl who served us wine at an East Village bar last year. Again, in a totally different neighborhood and at night, not during the day. It is true that I'm a big fan of people, of humanity, and diversity. But to my knowledge, I make no effort to record the physical traits of ice cream servers, shoe salesmen, and friends of friends of friends. Even a slim wedge of face, or the way someone walks 2 blocks away at dusk, can trigger my mind to zero in on a match. The super recognizers, Russell et al., write, are about as good as many lifelong prosopagnosics are bad. That is, they are about 2 or 3 standard deviations above average, while the most severe prosopagnosics have face recognizing abilities 2 or 3 standard deviations below average. Thus, the difference between the best face recognizers and the worst among us is comparable to that between people with an IQ of 150 and an IQ of 50, with others filling every level in between. As with any bell curve, the vast majority of people are somewhere in the middle. Severe congenital prosopagnosia is estimated to affect at least 2% of the population, 6 million people in the United States alone. A much higher percentage, perhaps 10%, are markedly below average in face identification, but not cripplingly face blind. For these people who have difficulty recognizing their husbands, wives, children, teachers, and colleagues, there is still no official recognition or public understanding. This is in marked contrast to the situation with another neurological minority, the 5 to 10% of the population with dyslexia. Teachers and others are more and more aware of the special difficulties and often special gifts which dyslexic children may have and are starting to provide educational strategies and resources for them. But for now, people with varying degrees of face blindedness must rely on their own ingenuity and strategies, starting with educating others about their unusual but not rare condition. Increasingly, prosopagnosia is the subject of books, websites, and support groups where people with face blindedness or topographical agnosia are able to share experiences and, no less important, strategies for recognizing faces and places when the usual automatic mechanisms are compromised. Ken Nakayama, who is doing so much to further the scientific understanding of prosopagnosia, also has a personal acquaintance with the subject and posts this notice in his office and on his website. Recent eye problems and mild prosopagnosia have made it harder for me to recognize people I should know. Please help by giving your name if we meet. Many thanks.